Hello, everybody, and welcome to Philosophizing In, the podcast about philosophy in lesser studied languages. This week, I'm going to be talking with Justin Smith-Ruiu about philosophy in the Sakha language of Eastern Siberia. Hi, Justin, how are you doing?
Hey, great. Nice to see you.
Excellent. So, I wanted us to get started today by talking a little bit about the language of the Sakha, language which is sometimes called the Yakut language, and the people that speak it. What's
Sure.
in the name?
Okay, where to start? Sakha is a Turkic language, the northeasternmost language in the Turkic family, which extends from, say, west of the Black Sea in southeastern Europe. There are pockets of Turkic languages in Romania, Bulgaria, across all of Anatolia, of course, through Central Asia. A number of the so-called stans, Kazakhstan, so on, are all Turkic, all speak Turkic languages as well. The Sakha people, or the Yakuts, as they're sometimes called, I don't have any strong preference for the one or the other, seem to have been based around the area of Lake Baikal, close to where the Buryats are, and in heavy synthesis with Mongol groups until the rise of Genghis Khan and the expansion of the Mongol Empire, when they seem to have, for various reasons, I think we can all understand, wished to live somewhere further from the center of the empire to avoid taxation or conscription or torture or any number of possibilities. And so they fled northward into the Lena River Valley, which is one of the coldest places on Earth, so cold that the Mongols seem to have thought it was not any longer worth their trouble to pursue these people in flight from them. And over the course of the following centuries, say 13th, 14th, 15th centuries, they developed a distinct culture, not just in the Lena River Valley, but also even further to the north into the Arctic, and where they met other either Paleo-Siberian people like the Yukagir or Tungusic people like the Evenks, and naturally had a very, let's say, culturally productive encounter with these different groups, all while retaining a kind of vague, almost mythological memory of their origins further to the south. Interesting feature of their oral epic tradition. The figure of Genghis Khan often comes up, but he comes up as a divinity, which
Mm.
is to say that he's been literally apotheosized into something more than a historical figure. And this could be because the information deteriorates as it passes from generation to generation, but there could be other more kind of logical internal reasons for this. So retaining some kind of shared cultural memory of a time when they were further to the south, but also significantly hybridizing with other more distinctly circumpolar cultures. And this lasts until the 17th century when the Russians arrive. And ever since the 17th century, there were several decades of Yakut resistance to Russian domination, refusal to pay tribute, and so on. But I think by 1700 or so, this had failed, and they were under Russian domination as they had previously been under Mongol domination. And of course, this culminates in the Soviet period, when there is, like I like to say sometimes, two cheers for Soviet support of minority
Mm.
uh, cultures. Under the Soviets, there was a very active campaign to kind of stimulate, cultivate a Sakha literary tradition, which would serve the purpose of kind of unifying the Sakha nation, of course, within the Soviet Union. And also, part of this, it was trying to create a kind of high art linguistic register for theater, even for opera, and for cinema and so on, which was quite active and productive over the course of the middle of the 20th century. Since 1990, the Sakha people have been more or less floating on their own without what you could call centralized state support from Moscow. And naturally, this, together with the rise of new information technologies, has very significant implications for the integrity and the quality of the language, both as spoken in an everyday context, but also as a literary language. And overall, the consequences of, let's say, going solo or losing state support have not been good. That said, some people imagine that it's a much more endangered language than it is. There are about 450,000 speakers of Sakha, which means that probably on the list of languages spoken in the world, it's among the top, right?
Mm.
I mean, it's hard for us to understand as English speakers, but Sakha is actually a kind of regional lingua franca, subordinate to Russian, but still, if you are a native speaker of, say, Yukagir, which is spoken by only a few hundred people, you're likely to speak both Sakha and Russian as you come into contact with other people in your broader region. So it's not dying out tomorrow, but it is in crisis, and it is, especially in urban settings, it's in crisis. And so I think part of my interest is trying to do what I can to kind of bring this linguistic world into contact with English, and, so to speak, circumventing the Russian middleman that has been responsible for almost all exposure that Sakha has had in the outside world. Just like, you can't really imagine accessing the Quechua language without
Mm.
Spanish, or circumventing Spanish. Similarly, Russian is the point of access to the Sakha language, even though they have nothing in common historically. Sakha today involves a lot of Russian vocabulary, and for young, urban, post-Soviet Sakha people, there's also massive code switching comparable to, say, New York City Spanglish or something like that.
Fantastic.
I could go on and on.
Oh, I'm sure, and that's such an excellent introduction for us sort of situating the language in its historical and geographical context. So I found it really interesting what you were saying about the different sort of points of contact
Mm,
between Sakha and other languages. So you have contact with Mongolian and Mongolic languages at this fairly
mm,
early sort of point before the migration to the north. Seems to be the first sort of major case of it coming into contact with really very much
mm,
a global language of a global empire. Then
mhm,
later on, you have contact with the Paleo-Siberian and the Tungusic languages to the north. These are the much more localized ones.
mhm,
Certainly now, at least as you were saying, in Russia, these are people who are going to be accessing the mainstream of Sakha regional culture. And I think is it right? The Sakha is the largest regional grouping on the planet.
It's the largest, yeah, if you compare it to either independent, well, it's the largest sub-national, or how should I put that? No,
Yeah.
that's not quite right. Like comparable to Canadian provinces or
Yeah.
American states, It is a republic within the Russian Federation, and this is curious notion, I think, for people outside of Russia, but it has a status that is probably, significantly more independent in certain respects
Mhm.
than, say, the province of Quebec or the state of Texas, and it is indeed the largest comparable unit on the planet. It's enormous, and extremely sparsely populated for reasons of climate.
And so people from small communities, maybe a community that speaks one of these Tungusic languages.
Mm.
So Evenk is one of
Yeah,
those, right?
I think,
So
yeah.
if you have some people who are speaking Evenk, they're going to be accessing something of the broader social, cultural, political life of the sub-national, or however we wanted to
Yeah,
put it, region via speaking Sakha. And then you have Russian, which is going to be accessing the national, again, the global imperial sort of.
yeah. Yeah,
Um,
well, yeah, I think, well, a lot of things to say here. First of all, I mean, there was a point when I really wanted to study a Paleo-Siberian language. I was actually thinking not so much of the northeastern kind of or circumpolar languages of the far north. I was really interested in Ket, a Yeniseian language,
yeah,
in because that's the one that seems to provide the most likely prospect for establishing a link with Native American languages,
Navajo and things like that.
the
Yeah.
so-called Yeniseian Na-Dene
Hmm.
hypothesis that links central Siberia to Arizona. So
Hmm.
that always fascinated me. The problem is there are just no resources out there. With Sakha, you can go on YouTube and listen to podcasts and, never exhaust the content that's out there. If you're studying a language with only 25 people speaking it, it's a lot harder. Um, so the I think the key distinction, the key cultural divide is one that is entirely geographically determined. Within Sakha culture, you have the people who settled the far north, who adapted or evolved into a form of life that is typical of circumpolar people around the world, including those of Canada and Alaska and Greenland, which is to say, hunting intensive and also extremely dependent on a world of snow and ice and little else. In the Lena Valley, which is so I think you could call it the core of the Sakha world. It's based on an August harvest of grass. That is then, the basis of the livestock husbandry, and really horses and cows, very special horses and cows that can survive in minus 50-degree winters, but nonetheless horses and cows that are at the center of Sakha social reality. Cherchez la vache, as Evans Pritchard said of the Azande. If you want to understand what's going on, look at how they're relating to their cows, right? That's just fundamental. Um, and then hunting and encounters with bears and other wildlife are, also important, but much less than, say, encounters with seals and polar bears in the far
Hmm.
north. I also wanted to mention to the northwest, in the actual administrative division of Siberia, not Yakutia.
Hmm.
There's another group called the Dolgan, who are almost like a creolized product of the encounter of three groups: the Yakuts moving to the northwest, Tungusic groups, but also Russian Arctic boatsmen who settled there, probably in the late Middle Ages. And so some of these people are as descended from Russians, ethnically Russian
Mhm.
people, as they are from Mongolic or Tungusic people, and that's how they look. But their form of life is, let's say, solidly North Asian and linguistically Tungusic and Mongolic, or Tungusic and Turkic, I should say. So it's really a fascinating world of hybrid identities, I think, and it's and the old distinction between, let's say, Western Russian, white European
Mhm.
versus Mongolic, Turkic, Tungusic, Asian just collapses somewhere in that gray area, the massive gray area of North Asia.
Absolutely. And the thing that sort of, I suppose, is common to these various different interesting groups, like you said, is that the extremity of the climate leads them to live very particular kinds of social, agricultural, insofar as it is agricultural or pastoral sort of lives. Um, and I'm interested in how this is reflected in the art and the ideas, and for our
Mhm.
purposes, maybe also the philosophy in
Yeah.
some way. So your project at the moment, as I understand, is to translate the Olonkho. Is that how
Mhm.
we pronounce it? The national epic of
Good
the
enough. Yeah.
Sakha.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and so I wanted to ask you basically, do you consider, could you tell us a little bit about this national epic, about your project in translating it, and also sort of whether we should, and if so, how we should consider epic poems like this to be a source of philosophy, of philosophical ideas?
Sure. Sure. Okay, where should I start? A few words about Olonkho and what it is, and
Yeah.
then we can move on to questions of philosophy. Olonkho is often mistakenly referred to as a single work, like you would refer to the Olonkho in the way you refer to the
Hmm.
Odyssey. This
Hmm.
isn't correct. Olonkho is rather a genre that has several, more than I at present know about, and I've been studying it for 7 years now. Several different legend motifs that keep returning again and again. And that are as wide and diverse as, say, medieval knights errant tales in Europe. Um, so it's a tradition of epic oral recitation by a special member of society known as the Olonkosut or Olonkohut, depending on your dialect. And this might be translated as bard. That's one way to think of the social role of the Olonkohut, is a bard who travels and is invited into a home in a village upon arrival to recite for the whole night. Basically, the recitation lasts an entire night and ends at dawn, and so might go on for 8 or 9 hours. And the longer he recites, the more he gets paid, and the more they like it, the more he gets paid. So, there are different components of the epic recitation that are, meant to hook and to keep people paying attention. Um, and there are parts that are strictly recitative, and there are parts that are sung. Um, is an Olonkho Hoot a musician? This is a question that I think really interests me recently. Um, I think what we're looking at here, if I can dare to speak this way, is a kind of primordial art form that combines elements of music and storytelling, and
Hmm.
likely also most of the time dance. And that we call poetry just because it's the closest thing we can think of. And it's already denatured when we call it poetry. It's even
Mm,
more denatured when we attempt to transcribe it and present it in a textual form. It's even more denatured when we not only transcribe it but translate it. So my English translations, which are I'm working on this with a Sakha collaborator named Lubomira Romanova for a publication in the World Literature and Translation series of the University of California Press. What we come up with, what we end up publishing, is really going to be, so to speak, a shadow of a shadow of a shadow.
mm,
It's a translation of a transcription of an oral performance that was recorded 80 years ago. And so you get a little bit of a sense of the guy in the room in the candlelight doing his thing like his ancestors did, but it's a distant trace. That's okay. We do what we can. Um, Now, a very brief word about the content, and then we can turn to the question of philosophy. I mentioned knights errant tales. It's a lot more than that because I would say the supernatural element is a lot more present here. And somewhat as in Greek mythology, you have a lot of intercourse between the different planes of reality, in particular the plane of the gods and the plane of the humans. Here, in Sakha culture, curiously, I think in ways that echo features, or let's say cosmological representations that we see across a wide swath of Eurasia. In Sakha culture, you have, let's say, a tripartite cosmic scheme, which is to say the upper world, the middle world, and the lower world. Ordinarily, human beings, well, which is to say Sakha people, inhabit the middle world. The so-called Ayu, and we can transliterate that as Aiyy, or the good spirits, typically inhabit the upper world, and the so-called Abasu, which is to say Abaasy, inhabit the lower world, as you would expect. The bad guys are underground and the good guys are in the clouds. That's a familiar a familiar way to lay things out. But there is a lot of back and forth, and there are a lot of encounters between humans and Ayu and Abasu, and even indeed marriages and hybrid children, and much like you find heroes in Greek mythology who are half divine. Similar thing here. Um, and so most of the epics relate the deeds of a hero, and a lot of really delirious supernatural encounters along the way, with spirits of the upper world, spirits of the lower world. All of this is represented. I should have mentioned this earlier because this is, I think, the pan-Eurasian connection. All of this is represented by the world tree, the so-called
mm,
al mas, of the sort. Mas means tree. Um, of the sort, it's comparable to Yggdrasil of the Vikings. The tree is the cosmos, in its epitome, and it connects all three of the realms and kind of facilitates interchange between them. And let's see what else. Oh, yeah. So also, I just wanted to mention that there is something powerfully comical about Olonkho as well. I think there's a much more kind of delirious comic element with a lot of obscenity and a lot of, let's say, really kind of grotesque scenes of sexual encounters between humans and quasi-humans. And when an ogre gets slaughtered, he doesn't just get slaughtered, he gets, an arrow that, how should I put it, goes up through his digestive system, and
Ah.
stuff like this. And it's all really quite funny, in a kind of like, Looney Tunes sort of way. So that's something to enjoy. Now, okay, so let me now move to philosophy. I've been going on about the general kind of contours of Olonkho long enough. One thing that I like to point out, and that I've pointed out to you in other conversations, is, let's take for comparison Homer, right? We know that what we call today the Iliad and the Odyssey were, for at least a few centuries before they were ever written down, we know that these were comparable bardic traditions, right? Thanks to Milman Parry in the 1920s and his comparative ethnological study of Balkan bardic traditions, it was, more or less established in the early 20th century that that's the origin of Homeric epic too. We have comparable traditions in West Africa, all over the world. There are comparable. I mean, the term oral literature is contested, but whatever. I'll use it for today. There are comparable oral literary traditions that encode and epitomize the whole range of cultural values and cosmic representations. Who are we? What is our place in the world? Where did we come from? And where are we going? Things like that.
Mhm.
Now, if you take the case of Homer, this gets recited in a comparable way for a few centuries. Then, little by little, people think it might be a good idea to write this down. So, in some sense, the only difference is that the writing down of the Olonkho begins in the late 19th century, and the writing down of Homer begins in the 8th century BCE, right? So
Mhm.
different moments in the history of these literary traditions happen at different times. Now, you might be saying, yeah, but Homer isn't philosophy. Well, yeah, right. But Plato and Aristotle certainly have to contend with Homer as an authoritative source on something, right? There's a weight of authority in these cryptic poetic proclamations, even if they aren't making arguments in the way that we
Mhm.
associate with philosophy. So in general, I'm of the view that philosophy should, to some extent, concern itself with cultural traditions that, as I put it in a number of different places, pack philosophical commitments into cultural expressions where these commitments are not defended in an argumentative way. Again, as I've put it in a number of different places, philosophy should take an interest in uh, uh, expressions of philosophy in the or form. That is to say,
Mm.
O-R-E, right? You've got iron, but it's packed into a rock, right? You've got iron ore. You can get the iron out by doing some metallurgy. Similarly, for complicated reasons, and certainly not as any kind of mark of cultural inferiority, some human cultures have real commitments about, who we are, what our place in the world is, where we come from, what is the nature of good and evil, what happens to the soul after death, and stuff like that. Many human cultures have those commitments, so to speak, packed into an ore. right? And I don't see any reason why we should stay away from these commitments as philosophers simply because you have to do a bit of metallurgy in order to get them out, if that makes sense. Um, and of course, that's contested because I am sounding there pretty close to the view of someone like Alexis Kagame in his defense of ethnophilosophy in regard to the Bantu linguistic cultural sphere. And what can I say? I understand the limits and the dangers of this. But I think it's better than the alternative because the alternative is only recognizing as philosophy those handful of cultures in human history that have done the metallurgical transformation themselves, right, and built up institutions where the sole purpose is to examine in a distilled or pure form these distinct fragments of culture that we recognize as philosophical commitments. I don't think they have to be distinct in order for that to happen.
Absolutely. And that idea of philosophy sort of in the awe of culture is one that I found really interesting in lots of the discussions that we've had throughout this series with various different people. There's so many different means by which to try and do this metallurgy, right? To try and do this extraction. You mentioned Kagame, look at the grammar of a natural language and try and extract a series of categories and a worldview from it, which you suppose you could do for Sakha just as easily as the Bantu languages he was looking at, or Quechua that you mentioned before, or the Tungusic languages. You could do this for any of them.
Mhm.
You could try and reconstruct a scheme from the national poems or the wisdom from the proverbs or something like that.
Mhm.
Or you could do, and I suppose, extracting philosophy from the ore it's clearer in those traditions that you were saying where people have already sort of done that work of writing their stuff in arguments. But
Mhm.
as you'd see in any history of philosophy journal, there's still a form of extraction to be done in arguing over, Kant's deduction or something
Yeah,
else like that. There's still a work that an intermediary has to do to find what the
yeah,
ideas really are.
yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
and I suppose one thing that I was interested in is an objection which is made to the very idea of there being oral philosophy. I mean, you mentioned that oral literature is a contested topic, oral philosophy, very much contested.
Mhm.
And one of the points made by the late, great Polan Huntunji was that the very idea of having oral literature, the necessity of focusing so much on memorization kind of precludes a critical engagement with ideas that he takes to be essential for philosophy, right? Such
Mhm.
that oral traditions might be able to describe things in various ways, but they're not going to be able to critique so much. So I suppose one question is, do you think that that's right at all? And on the
Mhm.
other hand, if something like Olonkho poetry is simply sort of depicting the natural and social world of the Yakuts, of their, beliefs of the relations between the upper and the lower realms, their orientation in the world, their relation to animals and things like that, can that constitute something worth calling philosophy?
Well, first of all, a few things. I'm only now learning that Paulin Untonji died, and I'm so sorry to hear that. This comes as a bit of a
Oh,
shock. He was, someone I knew, and we had some very good exchanges about Anton Wilhelm Amo over the years. So, yeah, devote this podcast to the memory of Untonji.
absolutely.
He
Absolutely.
was a wonderful person, and he did so much important work for our understanding of the idea of African philosophy. Um, so, well, I mean, it's complicated, and I'm on record as saying, I finished my PhD in philosophy 24 years ago. I still don't know what philosophy is. I mean, I really don't, and I honestly think that if my professional colleagues think they do, it's probably because they haven't, you know. pushed at its outer limits, right?
Mm.
They haven't gone looking for the borderline cases. And if you stay close to home, and work in an established tradition like, say, analytic metaethics or something like that, then this question of where is the boundary between philosophy and non-philosophy isn't going to strike you with the same force. That said, over the past 24 years, I've also seen held up for candidacy as philosophy works that no one would have considered in the 1990s. For example, I published a piece on Anton Wilhelm Amo in a volume on neglected philosophers that included people like Ida B. Wells, right? The
Mm.
the the African American woman in the 19th century who is generally classified as a journalist who wrote quite a bit on lynching and the great shame of racism in the United States after the Civil War and Reconstruction and all that. Um, is Ida B. Wells a philosopher? Well, she is now. We've
Mm.
we've conscripted her posthumously into the league, into the guild. And this isn't a way of knocking this choice. I'm perfectly happy with it. For what we have to recognize are, let's say, social, political, cultural exigencies that have come up in the early 21st century, right? And if we can do that, if we can posthumously conscript journalists, then I don't see why we should draw the line at the boundaries of our own culture. Ida B. Wells is, someone who, like us, reads and interacts with newspapers
Mhm.
and writes in English and so on and so on. I don't see why we should draw the line there and not go looking also for, let's say, people who are somewhat or quite a bit further removed from our cultural practices, like engaging with newspapers, for example, reciting oral epic poetry. In other words, once we've acknowledged that the argumentative treatise, the critique of pure reason, for example, doesn't exhaust what we're willing to consider as philosophy, but we can also find it in late 19th century newspaper columns, then I don't see why we should go on saying, sorry, get back to your argumentative treatises when someone tries to look at oral epic poetry from northeastern
Mhm.
Siberia. You know what I mean? We've proven, as a matter of fact, that as a discipline, philosophy is prepared to range beyond the argumentative treatise. And once we've done that, I think we just have to say, I'm gonna go look for whatever source material helps me to understand better what it is to be a human being in the world, or something like that, or what the nature of justice is, or whatever. And
Mm.
so, am I looking at here's maybe the question one would want to ask: am I looking at primary sources when I read a transcript of Olonkho, or am I looking at material that can serve as fuel for the subsequent production of a primary source in philosophy? And I guess I don't really care so much about that distinction. Um, uh, uh, but, I'm also happy to listen to pop music lyrics. Maybe not Taylor
Mm.
Swift, but maybe, I don't know, Ray Charles, and use that for stimulation of my reflection on what it is to be a human being and to feel love and loss and stuff like that. And so maybe this is just a temperamental thing, but like I'm a philosopher because my diploma says so. And
Mm.
beyond that, I take an interest in this and leave it to other people to figure out what the connection is. It remains an open question for me. What I will say is that I think Olonkho is uh, a much more kind of generative collection of source material than, say, the collected lyrics of Taylor Swift, for thinking about what it is to be a human being,
Hmm.
right? I'm gonna just, make that judgment right here. It tells us very substantial things about how one possible way of representing our place in the world, our relations with others, our relations with nature, the fate of the soul after death, and so on and so on. And so it's quite rich source material, and that's all I care about.
Absolutely. Well, I'll take it that you are going to be somewhat preaching to the choir in terms of the methodology with our audience. I'm sure that there are lots
Mhm.
of people who are going to be very sympathetic to the idea that there is something that we might find it productive to call philosophy, or that we might not be so worried about policing those traditional boundaries. Perhaps also people will agree that there'll be more in these Sakha traditions than in Taylor Swift lyrics, although you can't be sure. And
I haven't
I,
checked, to be honest, but yeah.
well, I mean, yeah, I'm no expert on either, but I thought that sort of, I mean, to be able to back that point up, could you just tell us a little bit about what some of the particularly interesting ideas that you have encountered in these contexts are, and maybe what the significance of their sort of original expression is, like
Mhm.
what is there about, the way that they're expressed in Sakha,
Yeah,
that
yeah.
you'll be able to convey for the audience.
Well, I mean, one important thing, and here this isn't distinctly Sakha or even distinctly Siberian.
Hmm.
And I think we will certainly find comparable representations in traditional cultures of the Americas in particular.
Hmm.
But still, it is important. I think any philosopher should take an interest in, or should spend some time understanding those groups of people that have, let us say, a broadly animistic conception of nature. Why should we spend time doing this? Because I would say it's the default relationship to nature in most times and places in human history and prehistory, right? It's the way human beings have generally related to the world around them.
Hmm.
It's a world that is teeming with spirits or animate forces, that have wills of their own that need to be placated, and most human energy goes into managing the relationship with these forces. Um, these forces include wild animals, bears, and so on, but also certainly natural phenomena like lightning and so on. And that is, let's say, a relationship to the world that I would go so far as to say we're probably kind of, let's say, that is our factory setting, so to speak, right? That's the way our brains were configured. And to appreciate it, to work your way into it, really helps to get a clearer understanding of, how the human mind works, right? In
Hmm.
particular, Daniel Dennett likes to talk about this. He's not the one who came up with the phrase, but the idea of the brain as hyperactive intentionality detection device, right? Why do we feel like we're being watched if we walk down a forest path in the middle of the night? That you could say, oh, that's just superstition. Get over your superstition, you fools. But it's also telling us something about our minds, right? Um, so that's a general thing, and I feel like I have a much better understanding of what it is um, to really respect bears and lightning,
Hmm.
and things like that in a way that I did not before. Now, somewhat more distinctly Siberian, uh, uh, in comparative ethnography and comparative religion, shamanism is a loaded term. And I think in general, there's some kind of agreement that probably, because of people like Carlos Castaneda and the idea of the Yaqui shaman and, its connection to kind of 1960s countercultural representations of broadly speaking, people with lots of mojo, right? We tend to shy away from the term shaman, but if it applies anywhere, it applies in North Asia, right? That's where the term was first used. That's where it was first described as a distinct religious representation and as a model of how nature works and how to, let's say, channel nature's forces. You find that most clearly in North Asia, and the Sakha people traditionally are shamanists. I mean, we also use the term tengriist sometimes to describe. That's a Turkic term that describes also the religion of pre-Islamic Turkic people all the way into Anatolia. Tangara in Sakha, Tengri in Turkish mean either sky or God, depending on context. So you've got, let's say, broadly speaking, Tengriist, shamanist representations and associated practices. Um, and I think this is significant because one question that keeps returning for me is, what is the social role of a shaman exactly? It is kind of priestly, but it's also kind of sketchy, right? A shaman is often kind of a weird dude who should be kept at a distance, and he's kind of like a beggar, kind of like someone, who you can't easily welcome into your home and stuff like that. But he's also someone who knows a lot, right? Now, here I was saying I should also mention an interesting fact about North Asia. Um, Different languages from different linguistic groups have different words for the male shaman. Shamaness, by contrast, is the same word across several different Tungusic, Mongolic, Turkic, Paleo-Siberian languages, which strongly suggests that there is an ancient or let's say archaic matriarchal form of shamanism that dominated in the region prior to the point that came much later when people started saying, hey, wait a minute, men can be shamans too, right? That's a late coming idea. And there's a substratum of matriarchy across North Asia. Um, these are representations that are I think key to understanding human experience again on its factory settings. And we ditched our factory settings and got a bunch of weird extra bells and whistles when we started practicing monotheism and going to giant cathedrals and then later valuing secular modernity and stuff like that. If you want to understand what it was like, before we traded out our factory settings, then you've got to pay attention to cultures like the one I'm attempting to. It might not be the best representative for this sort of lesson, but it's still pretty important. A few more thoughts here, and then I'll, then we can maybe move on to other things. Um, One thing that I mean, we see again the circulation of spirits and forces in all sorts of vivid ways, and this shapes practices in all sorts of vivid ways too. We see animals that sometimes can talk, sometimes can't talk. The talking horse that gives advice in a certain sequence of Olonkho is a recurring figure. We also see, again, in this kind of constant circulation of spirits, a particular preoccupation with the fissure on the top of the skull. And this is often covered ceremonially by like a metallic disc so that spirits cannot slip in through the fissure in your skull through the fontanelle and haunt you or make trouble. But this is also where babies come from. The baby spirit slips in through the top of the pregnant woman's skull. Um, and things like this that, no one would dare suggest you've got to affirm it as true, right? At least I'm not going to. But the more you learn, the more you get a kind of comprehensive picture of a very, very different way of representing, let's say, individuality, life, substance, power, and so on. Again, that I think, we need to be paying attention to. A final example that I really love and that I've written about a little bit is that traditionally, Sakha people have a sort of tripartite theory of soul, right? It's not the vegetative, the sensitive, and the rational. It's something different. You've got Iekut. Sorry, no, let me go in the other direction. Salgenkut, which is to say the air soul, which is what facilitates your ability to engage in conceptual and abstract thought, to deploy ideas. You've got Buorkut, which is to say earth soul, which is your body, right? And so this is weird because, ordinarily you would think, well, my body's not my soul. And, in this context, actually, no, it's just one manifestation of your soul. But then the one that interests me most is Iekut, which translates literally as mother soul, right? And that is to say your culture, right? And the motifs you weave and the recipes you cook and the games you engage in at the summer solstice festival and things like that. That's 1/3 of your soul right there, right? And the idea that an individual culture can have its own collective shared soul, that is constitutive of what you are, I think is also probably something that's much more common across the, all human experience than we tend to think. Um, Us, modern secular types who can hop from
Mm.
culture to culture and feel like we're taking ourselves with us. Um, Anyhow, I'm just giving you some examples here of representations, none of which I would take as true, but I mean, maybe it's because, I started out as a historian of philosophy. I'm working on Leibniz's metaphysics. No one ever told me I was supposed to take Leibniz's metaphysics as true either,
Mm.
right?
Mm.
Like what every corporeal substance is the phenomenal result of an infinite ensemble of immaterial monads. What? Seriously? So maybe because I, was kind of trained up in a kind of attitude towards the materials I was working on that was already a kind of distanced ethnographic gaze, so to speak,
Mm.
on a 17th century German erudite. It seems to me perfectly natural to move on to other representations that, to my mind, are no more and no less outlandish than the theory of monads, and to be like, what can I learn from this way of representing our place in the world, rather than again holding it up for candidacy as true, right? But again, it's just
Absolutely.
about my own disposition.
No, absolutely. I think it's a disposition that many people that are interested in these things share. It's certainly one that I share. I mean, in particular, I mean, the idea that there's nothing of any of the Sakha notions that you've mentioned just now that sounds any more outlandish than the monadology. I don't
Right.
imagine that
Yeah.
there are many, national myths or ideas from anywhere in the world that sound nearly
Right.
as
Yeah.
wild as the monadology does. And I really liked what you were describing in terms of both the sort of like dual action that engaging with some of these very unfamiliar ways of conceptualizing the world might have. So on the one hand, we see interesting different ways of carving up reality, right? Of
Mhm.
thinking about how our souls might relate to each other, about membership of a group ultimately means, how we orientate ourselves in the world. On the one hand, as this sort of, here's a positive alternative way of thinking about things. But in doing so, you realize the sort of strange contingency and parochialness of our particular,
Mhm.
whether contemporary secular or particular religious ways of viewing
Yeah.
things. So the realization of contingency. And it's just very interesting that that is one of the ways when we were setting this series up, that we're thinking about that's often very much the same as when you start to study philosophy in a different language. You
Mhm.
realize that some of these particular distinctions, maybe between believing to be true and knowing to be true, don't
Yeah.
really hit the same when you're working in a quite different language, right?
Right.
There's
Mhm.
both the positive side of seeing the alternative set of conceptual arrangements of distinctions and the like, and then
Mhm.
there's realizing, oh, the way that I'm doing it, which I really had considered to be totally universal and true everywhere and always, is in fact very much just one way of doing that.
Yeah, yeah,
So
yeah. That's
yeah,
so interesting. Yeah, yeah. A few thoughts here.
go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that's interesting to note is that over the course of the 20th century, again, with this top-down, centralized, Russo-centric imposition of a kind of imperial culture across Siberia, because that's what it was,
Hmm.
and still is. It's an imperial culture. Um, we unsurprisingly started to see translations of Marx and Engels and Lenin into Sakha. And even some pre-Marx, let's say, good guys, Hegel and, the ones who the Soviets considered, somewhat meritorious.
So
Uh,
we can read Hegel and Saka.
Yeah, I mean, not the complete works, certainly, but attempts were made. And what's interesting about these is that these attempts uh, uh, are heavily reliant on borrowings from Russian, right? Which are in turn often borrowings from Latin or German, right? When it comes to borrowings or calques, right?
Mm.
When it comes to philosophical terminology. But, if you look at a translation of the theses on Feuerbach or whatever into Sakha, you're going to see a huge, huge reliance on Russian vocabulary. And, of course, there are these efforts. Maybe you've talked about this with Bashir Diagne, but I think I've mentioned to you this the Cheikh Ante Diop, the
Hmm.
mid 20th century kind of spiritual forefather of Afrocentrism, has an incredible text where he, written in French, where he tries to give a glossary of chemical terms translated into Wolof without any reliance on Greek or Latin or French roots, right? And I don't speak a word of Wolof. I have no idea what he's coming up with there, but he's effectively trying to say terms like, evaporation. No, that's easy, but terms like sulfur dioxide or
Hmm.
whatever. Using only Wolof roots, and that looks like a major kind of almost Oulipian challenge to pose to yourself. Like, why would you do that? Science is a shared global vocabulary at this point. Just go back and resort to the Greek or Latin. Who cares, right? But the effort is really interesting. And, what you realize if you're trying to think about, say, the philosophy of mind or something specific like that, through the Sakha language, what you realize indeed is that the very idea that you can go and do that depends on massive mediation lexical conceptual mediation from another language, Russian in this case, from another language that has already, so to speak, been synchronized or calibrated with the tradition in question, right? That is to say, we have been coming up with equivalencies for Latin, German, French philosophical notions in Russian since, actually not that long, only since the end of the 17th century. 1698 was the first translation of Christian Huygens' Kosmotheoros into Russian. And there's a whole interesting story there. It doesn't go back that far, right? Whereas with the Vulgates of Western Europe, it's almost as if they became let's say, respectable national literary languages precisely through the process of assuring the learned that they were able to express the same ideas that had already been being expressed in Latin for several centuries before that, right? Peter Brown is great on this stuff, on the early modern history of dictionaries and glossaries and grammars of national languages as a key part of the emergence of national identities. Anyhow, so with Russian, you've got this from the end of the 17th century. With Sakha, you've really only got it, I would say, from it starts in the pre-Soviet period thanks to missionaries. Some of the first translations are of the New Testament, not so surprising. Let's say, broadly speaking, you've got attempts to anchor or to calibrate the Sakha language only from, say, 1890 to 1990. For 1 century, efforts were made to calibrate it. And again, as I put it earlier, but maybe now this is more fleshed out, since 1990, these efforts have stopped again, right? And now that it's in that sense that in the post-Soviet period, Sakha is again basically free floating, right? But most languages are free floating in that way. Most languages have not been calibrated to express concepts that are part of our philosophical tradition, or even concepts that are part of what we now think of as the globalized project of science, right? Which is why the Wolof French chemical dictionary was so interesting. Excuse me. So again, just to finish up this thought, learning a language like Sakha, which is again not as free floating as other languages, it would be a much greater challenge with Ket or Yukagir. Learning a language like Sakha that is at a different distance from this process of calibration than the ones we're used to using, I think is extremely eye-opening about, what gets expressed in different, let's say, local linguistic cultures and why. What are the forces bringing it about? When you are in a culture where you have to drop into another language, where you have to code switch in order to say epistemology, for example, things look really different, you know?
Fantastic. And I mean, it's such a nice example of, yeah, taking Marx and Engels and Hegel and the Bible into Sakha in the opposite direction. It always is, any case of philosophical translation, both what you're doing and what those earlier translators into Sakha were doing is such an interesting process of, on the one hand, enriching the Sakha language with so many different terms, ideas and distinctions, and on the other hand, of Sakha contributing a lot to our understanding of what philosophy can be.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think that's just such a lovely note for us to end such an incredibly rich discussion on. So
Yeah,
I want to join the whole audience in really thanking you, Justin, for sharing your
yeah,
interest and your expertise.
yeah. Thanks, Jonathan. It's always nice to talk.